She thought she could keep her dark secret hidden, but when the walls of her home start whispering, the truth can no longer be buried. What happens when a housewife's affair with a priest turns deadly? Stay tuned, because the shocking confession will leave you questioning everything. Don't blink, because the truth is far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears, heavy and thick. Claire stood by the kitchen sink, her hands trembling. The faint scent of lavender soap clung to her fingers, mixing with the sharp metallic tang of something else. Blood. It stained the white porcelain basin, dripping slowly from the edge of her carving knife. She stared at it, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The knife felt foreign in her grip, its weight anchoring her in place. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes. The branches of the old oak tree scraped against the glass like skeletal fingers. But inside, there was only the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. And his voice. Father Michael's voice echoed in her mind, soft, persuasive, intoxicating. "This is our secret, Claire. No one can know." She had believed him, clung to his words like lifelines in her lonely world. The confessional booth had been their meeting place. A sacred space turned into a den of whispered sins and forbidden touch. Claire closed her eyes, replaying the last moments. His hand on her wrist, pulling her closer. The flickering candlelight casting shadows on the cracked walls. The smell of incense, heavy and suffocating. Then, the shift in his tone, a darker edge, a demand she hadn't expected. "You'll never leave me, Claire. Do you understand?" Her fingers had tightened around the knife then, almost instinctively. The memory came back in flashes. The blade slicing through fabric, then flesh. His gasp, sharp and guttural, breaking the silence. Now, he lay crumpled on the floor of the study. His clerical collar askew, the crimson stains spreading like spilled wine on the worn carpet. Claire shuddered, forcing her eyes open. The house felt alive now, every creak and groan amplified. The clock on the mantel ticked relentlessly, marking time. She couldn't stop. A siren wailed in the distance, faint but growing louder. Panic bubbled in her chest, but she pushed it down. She wiped the knife, the blood smearing into a dull red streak. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, dancing across the walls. And then she heard it. A soft sound. A breath. From behind her. Claire froze. Her breath caught in her throat, sharp and painful. The sound wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. A rasp, low and wet, like air struggling to escape broken lungs. Her hand tightened on the knife. She turned, slowly, the floor creaking beneath her bare feet. The study door stood ajar, revealing a sliver of the dimly lit room. His body should have been still, motionless, but it wasn't. Father Michael's chest heaved faintly, his blood pooling around him like a dark halo. His eyes fluttered open. Barely, but enough. Enough to see her. To see the knife. To see what she had done. Claire's knees buckled, her grip loosening. The blade clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her closer to him. She knelt by his side, her hands hovering above his chest. The warmth of his. His lips moved, but no words came. Just a gurgling sound, thick and wet, as blood bubbled from his mouth. Tears streamed down Claire's face, blurring her vision. Her hands pressed against his wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. But it was too much. It kept flowing, unstoppable, staining her hands, her arms, everything. His eyes locked onto hers, wide and pleading. She wanted to scream, to run, to undo everything. But she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, drowning in the weight of her choices. Then his hand twitched. A sudden, jerking motion. His fingers curled weakly around her wrist, his grip like ice. Her breath hitched, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. And then he spoke. Barely a whisper. A single word that sent a chill down her spine. "Confess." Her stomach dropped. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around her. "No," she stammered, shaking her head. But his eyes burned into hers, unrelenting. "Confess," he rasped again, his voice a ghostly echo of its former strength. Claire scrambled back, her hands slick with blood. The candle on the table flickered wildly, casting jagged shadows that seemed to mock her. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown out the word, trying to silence him. But his voice wouldn't stop. "Confess," he rasped again, louder this time. The words seemed to reverberate in the room, bouncing off the walls, growing heavier with each echo. Claire stumbled to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. The knife glinted on the floor, but she couldn't bring herself to pick it up. Her back hit the wall, cold and unyielding. Father Michael's gaze never wavered, even as his body sagged against the floor. The pool of blood beneath him glistened, spreading like an accusation. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The air felt thick, suffocating, choking her. "No, no, I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her hands clutched at her chest, as if she could claw the guilt out of her heart. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, closing in on her. The scent of blood filled her nostrils, metallic and sharp, turning her stomach. Her vision swam, the edges blurring as panic took hold. "Please," she begged, though she didn't know to whom. Father Michael's lips moved again, forming the same word. This time, she didn't hear it. She felt it, a pressure in her chest, a weight crushing her ribs. The room seemed to tilt violently, the candlelight flickering in and out. She clutched the wall, her nails scraping against the plaster. Her legs gave way, and she crumpled to the floor. The sound of her sobs filled the room, desperate and raw. But his voice didn't stop. "Confess." It was everywhere now, surrounding her, echoing in her mind. The clock on the mantel chimed, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the chaos. Her head snapped up. The study door creaked wider, revealing more of the lifeless room beyond. But Father Michael wasn't moving anymore. His chest no longer rose. His eyes were open, glassy, staring past her. And yet, the voice persisted. "Confess." Her heart thundered, and she covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. "It's not real," she whispered. But when she opened her eyes again, she saw it. A smear of blood on the wall opposite her. The word, written in jagged, trembling strokes. "Confess." Claire's scream caught in her throat, strangled by terror. The word glistened on the wall, red and wet, dripping slowly onto the wooden floor. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself backward, further into the corner of the room. Her bloody dress clung to her skin, cold and suffocating. The candlelight flickered violently, casting the word in shifting shadows. "Confess," she mouthed, her lips barely moving. Her voice was gone now, swallowed by the oppressive silence. But the word lingered, alive in the air around her. The house groaned, its ancient bones creaking in protest. Somewhere above her, a faint thud echoed. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Claire's head snapped up, her pulse racing. She wasn't alone. The realization struck her like ice water, jolting her to her feet. Her bare toes slipped in the sticky pool beneath her, and she caught herself against the wall. The blood-stained word loomed inches from her face, taunting her. A metallic taste filled her mouth as she bit down on her lip, trying to suppress the rising tide of hysteria. "Who's there?" she croaked, her voice hoarse. No answer. Only the sound of the wind rattling the windows. And then the footsteps again.
Closer this time.
Claire's eyes darted to the door, now wide open. The hallway beyond was dark, an inky void that seemed to stretch endlessly. She strained her ears, her body frozen in place. A soft creak broke the silence, just outside the doorframe. Her breath hitched, and she backed away, her hands searching blindly for something, anything, to defend herself. Her fingers brushed the edge of a candlestick, cool and solid. She gripped it tightly, lifting it like a makeshift weapon. "Show yourself," she shouted, her voice cracking. The hallway remained silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that pressed against your skull, making it hard to think. Claire edged toward the doorway, her knees trembling with each step. The candle in the study flickered again, its flame sputtering as if gasping for air. And then it went out. The room plunged into darkness, and Claire's scream finally broke free. The darkness swallowed her whole. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of it pressing against her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears, deafening. She felt the cold air rush past her face, as if something was moving, something unseen. Her fingers gripped the candlestick so tightly her knuckles ached. The darkness stretched, endless and thick, until her eyes adjusted. A faint outline of the hallway began to take shape. But there was no one there. No figure in the doorway. No shadow lurking in the corner. Just the silence. Her skin prickled with the feeling of being watched. The kind of sensation that made your spine stiffen, your breath shallow. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. The floor beneath her creaked, a slow, deliberate sound. She jerked her head toward it, her pulse quickening. Another step. Another creak. Claire's chest tightened, and she turned on her heel, her feet scrambling to carry her away from the door. Her legs felt like lead, and she tripped over the edge of a rug, falling to the floor. Her palms scraped against the rough wood. She gasped, forcing herself to stand, but the sound of footsteps was growing louder. Closer. It wasn't her mind playing tricks. Someone was in the house. The footsteps were deliberate, now slow, heavy, almost mocking. She turned her head to the study window, her eyes searching the darkness outside. There was no one there, but she could feel it. The presence. It was watching her. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence followed. A breath almost imperceptible grazed her ear. Too close. Her skin tingled with fear, and her pulse raced uncontrollably. "Who's there?" she demanded, but her voice was barely a whisper. No response. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor made her flinch. It came from the study. She didn't know how, but she knew. Father Michael's chair. She couldn't move. Her legs locked in place, her body frozen with dread. The chair continued to scrape, louder now. The noise almost unbearable. And then a voice. A voice that made her blood run cold. "Claire." It was Father Michael's voice. But distorted. Weak. Like it was coming from the depths of the earth. Her breath caught. Her hand instinctively reached for the doorframe. But she couldn't make herself go forward. Her mind screamed at her to run. But her body wouldn't obey. The voice called her name again, a faint rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Claire?" It echoed through the room, vibrating in her bones. Her hands trembled, but she couldn't tear her gaze from the study door. The air grew colder, thick with something dark. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and shift, twisting unnaturally. She heard the faintest movement, like something dragging across the floor, pulling closer. A low, rhythmic scraping. It was coming from the study, from where Father Michael's lifeless body had fallen. Claire's stomach turned, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She forced herself to step back, her feet dragging in the thick, sticky silence. Her heart raced, but she couldn't run. Something was holding her in place. A force she couldn't see, but she could feel it pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Then, the chair scraped again, closer this time. A soft whisper followed. "Confess, Claire." Her hands flew to her ears, but the words still penetrated. It was as if they were inside her head, twisting her thoughts, making her dizzy. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. "Stop," she choked out, her voice breaking, but it was useless. The words, Father Michael's words, continued to crawl beneath her skin. The house creaked. The shadows seemed to grow longer, closer, as if the very walls were closing in on her. Her breathing grew frantic. She didn't know how much longer she could stay there. The scraping noise came again, now unmistakably coming from the study door. Her pulse hammered in her throat, a wild, frantic rhythm. She could feel the pressure growing, the air thick with the weight of what she had done. She had taken something sacred, destroyed it, and now it was coming for her. The door groaned, shifting just slightly, and then it opened. A crack. A small sliver of light spilling into the darkness. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw the figure in the doorway. It wasn't Father Michael anymore. At least, not entirely. The figure was twisted, distorted, like something pulled from the depths of a nightmare. The collar of his clerical shirt was torn, hanging loosely around his neck. His face was pale, nearly lifeless, but his eyes, they were wide, fixed on her, unblinking. The skin around his mouth stretched in an unnatural grin, revealing jagged teeth. His hands reached toward her. "Confess," he rasped. The word, his voice, everything around her became too much to bear. Claire's chest tightened, the air thickening, choking her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. Her chest heaved, her breath shallow, as if the very air had been stolen from her lungs. She tried to scream again, but the words stuck in her throat, trapped in a silent cage. The figure in the doorway took a slow step forward, its presence filling the room like a shadow that consumed everything in its path. Claire's eyes darted to the window, but there was no escape. The room felt smaller, walls closing in as the figure drew closer. His hand reached out, unnaturally long fingers, pale and stiff, stretching toward her. She couldn't move. Her body refused to respond, paralyzed by fear, by the weight of her own guilt. The figure spoke again, but this time the voice was no longer just Father Michael's. It was something darker, something ancient. "Confess, Claire," it croaked, its voice like 1,000 whispers merging into one. She flinched, recoiling from the sound. The air felt colder now, as if the temperature in the room had dropped below freezing. The blood on the floor seemed to freeze in place, solidifying into dark, jagged streaks. Her hands shook as she tried to push herself up from the floor. But the force in the room, whatever it was, held her down. The figure's eyes never left hers, its unblinking stare like a magnet, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears, louder than the voice. Her mouth opened, but no words came. The pressure in the room intensified, and for a moment, she felt as though she might suffocate under its weight. Then, without warning, a sharp crack split the air. The light bulb above flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. The figure lunged, its fingers grabbing hold of her wrist with a grip that felt like ice. A searing pain shot through her arm as if his touch were branding her. "Confess," the voice screamed. Claire felt a surge of adrenaline, the pain fueling her. She yanked her arm free, stumbling backward, her heart racing so fast she thought it might explode. With all the strength she could muster, she scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady. But the figure was closer now, its form towering over her, blocking her way. The dark presence was almost suffocating, and Claire's had spun. Her vision blurred, and she could barely hold herself upright. "Confess." The word lingered in the air, a suffocating mantra that circled her, tightening around her throat. She felt the weight of every moment, the betrayal, the violence, the secrecy crushing her. Her knees buckled again, and she collapsed to the floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The figure leaned in, its face now inches from hers. "Confess." The word was no longer a plea. It was a demand, a command. And this time, Claire couldn't escape it. Her body trembled, her pulse thrumming violently in her neck. The figure loomed over her, its face now a grotesque mask of twisted agony and hunger. Its eyes, hollow and unblinking, bore into her like a predator closing in on its prey. She wanted to scream, to run, but her limbs felt like lead, rooted to the cold, unforgiving floor. Her chest tightened, as though the very air around her had turned to stone, pressing down on her with unbearable weight. "Confess, Claire," it demanded again, its voice a twisted echo, sharper now, like a blade scraping bone. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear, to be swallowed by the shadows. But the word, the relentless voice, It pierced her like 1,000 daggers, forcing her eyes open. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in tighter, suffocating her, leaving no room to escape. The cold of the floor seeped through her skin, and the blood on her hands, Father Michael's blood, seemed to burn her. Her mind raced, spinning, replaying every moment, every step that had led to this. How could it have come to this? How could she have let it go so far? The figure's hand shot out, gripping her chin, forcing her head up. "Confess," it hissed, its breath hot and rancid, crawling up her neck. She could feel its fingers digging into her skin, bruising her, claiming her. The room spun around her, the shadows thickening, folding in like a suffocating fog. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last, drowning out all reason. I. Her voice cracked. It wasn't her voice anymore, not fully. It was broken, fragmented, like something torn apart. The pressure in her chest swelled, and she finally understood what the figure wanted. It wanted her to break, to confess everything, to reveal the truth, the dark secret that had been buried beneath layers of lies and silence. Her breath caught in her throat, but then the words began to spill out, uncontrolled, like a dam breaking. "I killed him," she whispered, the words scraping against her throat, raw and jagged. The figure's grip tightened, its face contorting into something even more monstrous. "Say it again," it demanded, its voice shaking the very air around her. "I killed him," she gasped, louder now, the weight of it finally breaking through. The floodgates opened. Her confession poured out, a torrent of guilt, of fear, of everything she had done. The affair, the betrayal, the violence. It all spilled out in jagged breaths, words she had hidden from herself for so long, but now they were free. And the room, the house, seemed to tremble with the weight of her confession. The figure's face twisted in satisfaction, a cruel, cold smile spreading across its lips. And for the first time, Claire felt something dark and final settle inside her. The moment her confession left her lips, the room seemed to freeze. The shadows, once alive with movement, now stood still, heavy with the weight of her words. Claire's chest heaved, each breath a struggle against the crushing guilt that now felt like a tangible force pressing against her. The figure's grip on her chin tightened, its cold fingers digging into her skin. It leaned in closer, its breath hot and foul, filling her senses. But Claire didn't flinch. She had said it. The truth was out, and it could no longer be taken back. The figure's face twisted into something hideous, a grotesque smile pulling at the corners of its mouth. "Good," it whispered, its voice thick with satisfaction. Claire's eyes locked onto the thing that had once been Father Michael, but now it was nothing more than an embodiment of her darkest fears. The room grew colder, and she could feel the weight of everything, the lies, the violence, the broken trust, pressing down on her. "I killed him," she repeated, this time to herself, her voice hollow, like an echo from a distant place. The figure released her chin, but it remained close, hovering over her like a dark cloud. Claire wanted to move, to escape, but her body wouldn't respond. She was trapped, not just in this room, but in the prison of her own choices. The floor beneath her felt like ice now, the cold sinking deep into her bones. The silence in the room was suffocating, the oppressive weight of the truth hanging heavily in the air. It was done. There was no going back. The figure took a step back, its form flickering like a shadow at the edge of her vision. For a moment, it seemed to vanish, and in its place, Claire saw someone. Father Michael. Not the twisted creature from before, but the man she had once known. He stood at the doorway, his face pale but soft, his eyes kind. But then, the vision blurred, and he was gone, replaced by the figure once more. "Confess," the voice growled, but this time it was weaker, distant. And then, in an instant, the figure vanished entirely. The room was silent, empty. But Claire could still feel it, the weight of what she had done clinging to her like a shadow she couldn't escape. And in that silence she understood. There would be no redemption. No forgiveness. Only the burden of truth. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Claire sat frozen, her body numb, her mind spinning in a haze. Her heart pounded in her chest, but the sound was muffled, as if it came from a distant place. The shadows in the room were still, no longer shifting or growing. Everything felt strangely calm now, unnaturally calm, as though the storm had passed, leaving only an eerie stillness in its wake. The weight of her confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But the figure Father Michael was gone. The room was empty. No more whispers. No more demands. Just the sound of her own breathing, ragged and uneven. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and made her way to the study window. Outside, the world was still. The moon hung high, casting pale light over the empty streets below. There were no sounds of life, no movement, just the cold stillness of the night. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, haggard, broken, a woman lost in the aftermath of her own actions. The truth had been laid bare. Her heart ached with the weight of what she had done, the irreversible choices she had made. There would be no undoing it, no erasing the past. The man she had once known was gone, and in his place was only the shadow of guilt that would haunt her for the rest of her days. But she knew one thing now. The house, the presence, the darkness, it had been a reflection of her own soul, twisted and fractured by the lies and violence she had buried deep within. And now the house was still, just as she would be. The dawn would come eventually, and the world would go on. But for Claire, there was no redemption, no salvation, only the quiet, painful truth. And as she turned away from the window, the weight of it all settled deeper into her bones. The past had caught up with her. And now, there was nothing left to do but live with it. In the end, that was the hardest truth of all.